Empaths have a dark side. Be careful. We have spent decades romanticizing the empath. We paint them as gentle healers, intuitive protectors, and the ultimate antidotes to a cold world. Thoughtful. We tell ourselves that feeling deeply is synonymous with loving purely. But what if the very trait that allows someone to heal you is also the exact weapon they use to dismantle you? Consider what actually happens inside the brain of a highly sensitive person. When someone possesses extreme emotional resonance, they do not just observe your feelings, they absorb them. Their nervous system mirrors your distress, your anxiety, your unspoken anger. Curious. At first glance, this looks like the ultimate gift of human connection. But look closer at the mechanics of self-preservation. When a human being is constantly flooded by the emotional trash of everyone around them, a survival instinct kicks in. The mind seeks safety. And when safety is threatened, empathy mutates. Suddenly, that deep, intuitive understanding of your soul is no longer being used to comfort you. It becomes an invisible surveillance system. The empath begins to read your subtlest micro-expressions, not to support your growth, but to preemptively manage your mood so they don't have to feel uncomfortable. Care transforms into quiet control. Understanding turns into subtle manipulation. And because the empath's identity is anchored in the belief that they are the good one, they are entirely blind to the harm they inflict. Think about the most emotionally intuitive person in your life, the one who always knows what you're thinking, the one who claims to give everything and ask for nothing. Have you ever felt an unexplainable sense of walking on eggshells around their selflessness? Have you ever noticed how their pain somehow becomes your fault? That is not random. That is the dark side of empathy at work. Empathy is not a saintly halo. It is a high-powered psychological radar. And like any radar, depending on who is steering the vessel, it can be used to navigate a rescue boat or guide a missile straight into your most vulnerable fault lines. If you believe empaths are harmless simply because they feel deeply, you are missing half the psychological equation. Tonight, we are pulling back the curtain on the hidden mechanisms of the dark empath. Because until you understand how emotional sensitivity can be weaponized, you remain defenseless against the most insidious form of control there is. The kind that comes wrapped in a smile, a sigh, and the words, "I just feel things too much." Empathy is often treated as an absolute moral virtue, but scientifically, high emotional sensitivity is a neutral perceptual tool, not an inherent guarantee of goodness. When an empath pairs high cognitive empathy, the ability to map how others think, with suppressed resentment, they gain an uncanny subconscious ability to target another person's deepest insecurities. Unchecked emotional absorption inevitably leads to burnout. When empaths burn out without self-awareness, their altruism morphs into covert passive aggression and moral superiority. What looks like extreme consideration is frequently a defense mechanism, an attempt to control everyone else's mood so the empath doesn't have to experience internal emotional dysregulation. Moving from a reactive, shadow-driven empath to an emotionally intelligent master requires setting firm boundaries, acknowledging personal shadow traits, and dismantling self-victimization. Empathy is routinely elevated to the status of an unquestioned moral absolute, celebrated as the ultimate proof of human goodness and the foundational remedy for interpersonal conflict. We operate under a pervasive cultural assumption that the capacity to feel what others feel automatically makes a person benevolent, trustworthy, and inherently safe. Yet, from a rigorous psychological and neuroscientific standpoint, empathy is not a moral virtue at all. It is a value-neutral perceptual system. It is an emotional radar network hardwired into the human brain, designed to process social signals and mirror external emotional states. Like any instrument of perception, whether it is high intelligence, keen observation or verbal fluency, empathy possesses no inherent orientation toward good or evil. Its moral direction is dictated entirely by the character, self-awareness, and hidden motivations of the person operating it. To understand why this distinction is critical, one must examine how emotional resonance functions within the human mind. The biological infrastructure of empathy, primarily involving mirror neuron systems and effective neural circuits, is designed for detection and processing, not ethical decision-making. It enables an individual to perceive another person's emotional reality, but it does not dictate what that individual chooses to do with that information. A person can register your deep anxiety, sadness, or insecurity with extreme precision, but that perception alone does not guarantee compassion. In fact, raw empathy can operate entirely detached from goodwill. When highly sensitive individuals experience emotional flooding from those around them without possessing the self-regulation required to process it, their immediate reaction is often self-preservation rather than altruism. When we confuse high sensitivity with moral righteousness, we create a dangerous blind spot in our interpersonal relationships. We assume that because someone sheds tears easily, senses tension instantly, or speaks fluently in the language of emotional depth, they are incapable of harm. This miscalibrated trust allows subtle forms of emotional manipulation to go unnoticed. The myth of pure benevolence creates a shield behind which unhealthy behaviors can thrive without scrutiny. An emotionally perceptive individual can use their heightened sensitivity to chart the precise topography of your psychological vulnerabilities, learning exactly which buttons to press to elicit reassurance, guilt, or compliance. Because society routinely equates feeling deeply with caring deeply, the victim of this dynamic is often left questioning their own sanity, unable to reconcile the empath's apparent sensitivity with the emotional damage being inflicted. Furthermore, attributing inherent goodness to empathy ignores the dark reality of how perceptual tools function when driven by unhealed personal wounds. Sensitivity combined with unresolved insecurity frequently produces a need to control one's environment. The ability to feel another person's mood turns into an obsession with regulating that mood so as not to feel internal discomfort. This is not benevolence. It is hypervigilance disguised as care. Realizing that empathy is merely a neutral mechanism strips away the romanticized illusions that prevent us from seeing dynamics clearly. It forces us to evaluate people not by the intensity of their emotional reactions or their ability to feel what we feel, but by their concrete actions, their personal accountability, and their respect for individual boundaries. True moral integrity is not determined by how much emotional data your brain absorbs from the room, but by the conscious ethical choices you make once that data has been received. When cognitive empathy, the precise mental ability to map, understand, and predict another person's thoughts, emotional states, and psychological triggers, is detached from genuine compassion and paired with suppressed resentment, it transforms into an exceptionally potent tool for emotional manipulation. Unlike affective empathy, which involves physically feeling what another person feels, cognitive empathy is a calculating, analytical process. It functions like an internal intelligence network, continuously gathering data on the people around you. An emotionally perceptive individual with high cognitive empathy builds a detailed psychological blueprint of your psyche. They observe what makes you feel valued, what triggers your deepest shame, which words ignite your self-doubt, and where your personal boundaries are most fragile. Under normal conditions, this data might be used to foster intimacy or provide support, but when resentment enters the equation, the entire system is weaponized. Suppressed resentment acts as the hidden fuel for this dynamic. When an empath chronically overextends themselves, absorbs emotional distress without setting clear boundaries, or feels unrecognized for their sensitivity, anger accumulates beneath the surface. Because their identity is strictly tied to being the good, selfless person, they cannot express this anger through direct conflict or healthy assertion. Direct confrontation would shatter their self-image as a benevolent figure. Instead, the mind seeks covert channels to discharge this hostility, and cognitive empathy provides the perfect vehicle. The underlying resentment directs the analytical capacity of cognitive empathy to seek out the target's most acute vulnerabilities, not for the purpose of destruction in an overt way, but to level the emotional playing field and regain a sense of power. The execution of this weaponized empathy is almost impossible to catch in real time because it is delivered through surgical, micro-level interactions. A person operating with this combination does not need to resort to loud insults or obvious aggression to disarm you. Instead, they use their precise understanding of your internal world to drop subtle remarks, heavy pauses, or unsolicited observations disguised as genuine concern. They know exactly how to frame a statement so that it hits your specific insecurity while maintaining complete plausible deniability. A comment about your career progress, a subtle question about your relationship security, or a quiet sigh after a decision you made is calibrated specifically to ignite your internal anxiety. If you attempt to confront them, their cognitive empathy allows them to anticipate your argument, reframe the situation instantly, and position themselves as the caring party whose well-intentioned words were tragically misunderstood. What makes this dynamic particularly insidious is that much of it operates on a subconscious level, driven by defense mechanisms that shield the individual from their own darkness. The person weaponizing their insight often genuinely believes they are helping or simply pointing out the truth, entirely blind to the covert malice driving the impulse. The receiver, meanwhile, is left in a state of profound psychological disorientation. They experience a sharp, real sting of self-doubt or guilt, yet every external metric tells them that the person who delivered the blow is sensitive, intuitive, and deeply caring. This friction creates a form of invisible control, where the target slowly begins to censor their own feelings, walk on eggshells, and defer to the manipulator's emotional climate, completely unaware that their deepest psychological vulnerabilities are being actively exploited to manage their behavior. The trajectory of the martyr complex begins long before any overt dysfunction becomes visible, rooted in an unexamined pattern of chronic self-neglect and blurred personal boundaries. When an individual possesses high emotional sensitivity, they frequently absorb the feelings, anxieties, and unaddressed distress of those around them. Without the psychological tools to regulate this constant influx of emotional data, they default to a strategy of relentless fixing, pleasing, and rescuing. They position themselves as the ultimate emotional shock absorber for their social circle, taking on responsibilities that are not theirs, giving unprompted advice, and constantly sacrificing their own physical and mental well-being to maintain harmony. Over time, this repetitive pattern gives birth to the martyr complex, a psychological state where self-worth becomes entirely contingent upon sacrifice, and personal suffering is interpreted as proof of superior love and moral devotion. As this cycle continues without interruption, the biological and psychological reality of human limits inevitably asserts itself, leading directly to profound burnout. No human nervous system is built to continuously process both its own internal states and the unmediated emotional distress of everyone else. However, because the martyr's entire identity is anchored in being endlessly available and endlessly giving, acknowledging exhaustion feels like a moral failure. Instead of halting the behavior, setting firm boundaries, or asking directly for what they need, the exhausted individual forces themselves to keep giving from an empty cup. This creates a severe internal dynamic where genuine compassion dies, replaced by a deep, festering reservoir of unexpressed resentment toward the very people they are claiming to serve. When burnout occurs alongside unacknowledged resentment, the empath's altruism undergoes a complete transformation, morphing from genuine care into covert passive aggression and a deep-seated sense of moral superiority. Because the martyr cannot openly express anger, as doing so would shatter their self-image as the selfless caretaker, the resentment escapes sideways. It manifests as heavy sighs, cold silences, weaponized martyrdom, and subtle, guilt-inducing commentary designed to make everyone around them feel perpetually indebted. Statements like, "After everything I do for this family," or "No one ever thinks about how much this costs me," become standard tools for managing social dynamics. The care that was once given freely now comes with an invisible, exorbitant emotional tax that everyone in their orbit is forced to pay. At this stage, moral superiority acts as a psychological armor, protecting the individual from confronting their own toxicity and lack of accountability. They view themselves as tragic figures trapped in a cold, unfeeling world that continually takes advantage of their good heart. This narrative of perpetual victimhood creates a bulletproof defense mechanism against any constructive feedback or boundary setting from others. If someone attempts to address their passive-aggressive behavior or request distance, the martyr immediately reframes the boundary as an act of profound cruelty and ingratitude. The dynamic becomes entirely inverted. The person causing emotional distress through quiet manipulation operates under the total conviction that they are the sole victim in the situation, rendering real resolution, self-awareness, and authentic emotional connection virtually impossible. What appears on the surface to be extreme consideration, sensitivity, and deep emotional attunement is frequently an intricate defense mechanism rooted in hypervigilance and a desperate need for environmental control. In individuals with heightened emotional absorption, the nervous system functions in a constant state of high alert, perpetually scanning the surrounding social landscape for micro-changes in body language, facial expressions, tone of voice, and emotional energy. This hypervigilance often develops early in life, typically born out of environments where emotional safety was unpredictable, requiring the individual to read the room constantly to survive emotional turbulence. Over time, this survival skill becomes so deeply ingrained that the person automatically tracks everyone else's internal state. However, because their emotional boundaries are porous, they do not merely perceive another person's shifting mood. They physically and emotionally absorb it as if it were a direct threat to their own immediate safety and internal equilibrium. When an individual's nervous system cannot separate its own emotional state from the distress of others, a subtle but powerful psychological drive takes over. The impulse to manage everyone else's feelings so they do not have to experience internal emotional dysregulation. When someone in their vicinity becomes anxious, angry, sad, or distant, the hypervigilant individual feels a sharp spike in their own distress. To quiet their own internal alarm system, they immediately step in to fix, soothe, de-escalate, or alter the other person's mood. They might offer unasked-for solutions, shower the person with excessive reassurance, try to smooth over minor conflicts instantly, or constantly ask, "Are you mad at me?" While this behavior looks like an act of selfless care and extreme empathy to an outside observer, its primary subconscious goal is self-preservation. It is an attempt to regulate one's own internal nervous system by controlling the external emotional climate. This transformation of hypervigilance into covert control creates a deeply restrictive dynamic for everyone involved in the relationship. When care is driven by an intolerance for emotional discomfort, The other person is denied the psychological freedom to experience their own natural range of human emotions. A partner, friend, or family member is subtly signaled that having a bad day, feeling frustrated, or needing space is an unacceptable breach of peace that makes the hypervigilant person suffer. If the struggling person does not immediately cheer up or accept the offered help, the hypervigilant individual often reacts with anxiety, guilt trips, or quiet resentment, feeling that their attempts to help are being rejected. The implicit message becomes clear: you are not allowed to be dysregulated because your dysregulation causes me pain. In this way, what began as intuitive emotional awareness deteriorates into an invisible leash, forcing everyone around the individual to mask their true feelings and walk on eggshells simply to keep the peace. The transition from a reactive, shadow-driven empath to an emotionally integrated individual requires a fundamental shift in how one manages emotional perception, personal responsibility, and self-identity. For many highly sensitive people, the default mode of operation is purely reactive, absorbing surrounding emotional states, allowing those states to dictate internal equilibrium, and resorting to covert control, martyrdom, or passive aggression when overwhelmed. Dismantling these destructive patterns requires a conscious commitment to developing emotional intelligence, a discipline that begins with the deliberate establishment of firm, non-negotiable personal boundaries. Boundaries act as an essential psychological filter, allowing a person to care for others without taking ownership of their emotional struggles. Learning to say no, resisting the impulse to fix every uncomfortable situation, and permitting others to experience their own pain without intervention are the foundational steps toward reclaiming emotional sovereignty. Crucial to this evolutionary process is the willingness to look inward and confront one's own shadow traits. It is easy for an empathetic person to hide behind a self-conception of absolute benevolence, viewing themselves as a perpetual victim in a harsh world. However, true maturity demands that the individual acknowledge how their sensitivity has been weaponized, admitting to moments of passive-aggressive control, moral superiority, guilt-tripping, and subtle manipulation. Shadow integration requires recognizing that emotional perception is simply a tool, neutral in its nature, and that the urge to manage someone else's mood is often a selfish attempt to soothe one's own internal anxiety. By bringing these hidden dynamics into the light of conscious awareness, the individual strips them of their power, transforming unexamined survival mechanisms into deliberate, ethical choices. Finally, breaking free from shadow-driven empathy requires the systematic dismantling of the victim narrative. As long as a person views their sensitivity as an involuntary curse or a martyr's cross, they remain trapped in a cycle of burnout, resentment, and covert control. Moving beyond self-victimization means accepting full accountability for one's own emotional regulation, energetic limits, and relational choices. It means shifting from a mindset that asks, "Why is everyone taking from me?" to one that asks, "Where failed boundaries did I fail to enforce?" When an empath surrenders the need to be the righteous sufferer, they free themselves and those around them from an oppressive emotional dynamic. Integrated empathy does not mean feeling less. It means possessing the strength, self-awareness, and psychological clarity to feel deeply while remaining grounded, autonomous, and accountable for one's impact on the world.